Hello again from AM Builds. Today's video is part 1 of my design for a crosscut sled for the Festool TKS 80 and covers the sliding mechanism which fits to the saw table upon which the sled sits and slides. The Festool TKS 80 is the only saw stop equipped table saw available in the UK and is designed to be portable for high quality on-site work. I've been morphing mine into a pseudo shop cabinet saw with my shop cart linked below, and now I have added a crosscut sled to enable accurate and convenient cutting with tear out minimised by a zero clearance floor and fence. There are no grooves in the top, used universally to create easy runners upon which to mount the sled, and overcoming this is today's subject. Please can I ask you to let this video play to the end along with clicking the usual 3 buttons. We're just beginning to recover some of the expense we've laid out for software and AV equipment, and doing this and commenting may stimulate the algorithm to suggest it for others and help support us. Thank you. I bought a linear bearing kit. These are used in many industrial machines, and there is a rigid bar with blocks that slide along the bar on ball bearings. It creates the possibility of precise fore and aft tracking of a board on the saw. I reckon I'll come up with something for the threaded rod in the future, perhaps in my router table. The link for my patches is below, and the bar is 20mm wide and a seriously strong bit of kit. I'm using them upside down so the blocks are downwards and the sled can sit on the rail. This makes the top able to move far enough fore and aft for my needs. The blocks come with a plastic keeper, which suggests to me that you could lose your balls if you're not careful, and grovelling around in a dusty workshop trying to find them would be a challenge to say the least. Sliding the keeper back a little, I introduced the shaft onto the end of the block and pushed it through, ejecting the keeper, and repeated the process with the second block. Using 2 8mm dowels and a mallet, I hammered one into each end of the shaft and trimmed them down a little using a trim saw. This means the blocks are now captive on the shaft and cannot fall off, spilling the balls. The next step is to find a registration surface on the saw, and the V-groove sides should be parallel to the blade and are fixed and durable. I need to make a component to reliably fit in this groove. During my surgical career when fixing fractures, you had to identify and consider all of the forces acting on the fragments and neutralise those forces so that your repair would last long enough for the patient to heal. I no longer have healing patients, but the thought process is the same, and I reckon the V-groove would easily handle the weight of the sled and control side-to-side movement, but I needed to control fore and aft movement along the groove and any tendency to tip up, especially at the far end of the saw when the sled was overhanging at the front. I first made a component to fit in the groove. I have a woodworker's bone pile for the pieces that didn't work out or where I've made a mistake. The long piece is aside from my TV proscenium where I didn't like the pattern of the chamfer. I cut this one into 3 and the wider piece was a rejected test stain sample of skirting board, stroke baseboard for my new sitting room, ripped down to match the narrower pieces. The wood is European oak, ideal for this task. They are about 100mm longer than the V-groove to allow for any planer snipe and trimming. I sawed a 45-degree angle along one edge of the 4 pieces and set up my planer. The point of the cut is not sharp. I've learned that can be very sore on the hands and also trashes the aluminium rulers on my saw if running downwards on the bed. Running them 4 up in parallel, I planed away 0.5mm increments until I thought they were about the right thickness, about 12mm. Pairing them up, they would sit nicely in the groove. Time for a glue up. Not sure where the subsequent rip cut and fixings might go, I didn't use brads to locate the parts and used my squeeze clamps to hold them together and then applied my Irwin and Bessie clamps as you see. I reckon there would be negligible separation forces acting on the 2 halves as the table groove would tend to force them together, so no fixings were needed, just glue. Here's a wee plug for my bench and the video we made about it, link below. Standing at this end of the bench, all of these clamps are in the end recess of the bench, meaning I could clamp the strips without taking a single additional step, and unclamp and replace the clamps with no walking. I would commend this arrangement to everyone. All set, and the next step was to rip them down to be just below the tabletop. I ripped them at 30mm, but that width depends how pointy your 45-degree cuts are, so assess the situation with a straight edge and home in on the correct width, duplicating the final cut with the second piece. I then cut them to exact length on the miter saw, using a bit of plywood as a sacrificial back support to prevent tear out. Retain the scraps as they will be handy later in the build. I then had to make a support on the extension table side of the saw. If you are making a sled for only the saw, you won't need to do this. I have my shop cart, video link below, and I needed 30mm on my shop cart side to make it vertically in line with the V-groove, so I glue laminated an 18mm and 12mm piece. I trimmed it to the length of the wooden cart side and ran a pencil round over all of the free edges. I would later trim it for depth and rerouter it. Clamping it to the cart tight against the underside of the V-groove, I unscrewed the extension table to allow me to drill and screw the piece from the inside. I marked the screws for easy identification. Here it is in place and showing the vertical side is in line with the side of the V-groove. My bearings are 44mm wide, and I glued up some Baltic birch to be in excess of that, and having allowed the glue to dry, planed it down using my thicknesser to an even 44mm. I was surprised how well my wee Makita coped with this. Although the ply is so smooth for the drive mechanism, the wood needed a bit of manual push and pull through the planer. I was patient with the process, just taking 1/8 of a turn or 0.25mm with each pass. I made 2 pieces, but in the end one piece 160mm wide would have been enough, again around 900mm long, so there was ample length for trimming in any snipe. I ripped the plain piece to 75mm. I then ripped 2 pieces of 6mm Baltic birch ply. The depth of the side of the table was just over 100mm, and I wanted my strips to be wider than that. The length happened to be around 900mm, which suited me fine, as I wanted 100mm either end to give me plenty overlap as I established how to terminate the ends. I then screwed one of these 6mm ply pieces to the oak, level at the top, using 4x20mm screws. I clamped the pieces together and pre-drilled through the ply and just into the oak with the 3mm drill, and the screws countersunk themselves in when driven. The bearings have M5 tapped holes at 32x36mm centres, and I needed 4 bearing plates so that I could screw down to the 44mm plywood section. I chose to make the plates 6mm thick, and this meant that I needed M5 by 10mm countersunk socket head screws, an unusual size, and so I turned to my favourite auction site and placed an order. I 3D printed the bearing plates out of PETG, a tough plastic used in the manufacture of fizzy drink bottles. You could make them with a good quality ply, or indeed aluminium, steel or HPL, whichever is convenient and or best matches your skills. It was then a case of setting the level. As with any fiddly low-level task, the first job was to deploy the trusty Dalek so that I would have a good viewpoint and a comfortable working position. I roughly set the 44mm plain ply piece 36mm down from the tabletop and clamped it loosely at the ends. I then positioned the shaft and bearings on top of the 6mm bearing plates I had 3D printed. I wanted the top of the shaft to be a whisker above the table, and put down pieces of Gorilla gaffer tape, which is about 0.4mm thick, and aimed to have the straight edge level when pressed into the tape, so perhaps I was 0.3mm above the tabletop. It's a fiddle, especially on your own, but it does come with time. Once happy, the clamps were nipped up and the 2 pieces screwed together through the 6mm ply, as before with short 3mm pilot holes. I then needed to produce locating pieces for either end of the V-groove to neutralise the fore and aft forces. Using some more of the oak 40mm wide, I planed it down until it was a comfortable loose fit for the thickness, the red spacer being 1mm. I put a 45-degree chamfer on one end, not creating a sharp end though, and put it in place and marked across. I didn't want that piece registering on the table at all, apart from the ends of the V channel, and so I marked a cut line about 1 mm or so shorter and cut it off. This is it in place with a 1 mm spacer. The second one was made similarly. The combination of these pieces will neutralise fore and aft movement of the whole assembly and create an easy lift-on locator for it. I then glued and clamped them in place, giving time for the glue to go off. This allowed me to screw them from both sides for a secure join. I then applied the other piece of 6 mm ply on the bench, using the second piece of V oak as a packer to keep it level with the bench so I could set the top aspect accurately with my tri-square. 4x40 mm screws every 100 mm as before. Trimming to depth was next. I ripped the bottom of the assembly on the table saw enough to create a clean surface, and then using some plastic spacers I established that removing a further 7 mm from the bottom would make the bottom of my bearer level with the underside of the table rail, and I ripped that to size on the saw. It was 103 mm if I remember correctly. I trimmed the assembly level with the edge of the oak end pieces, and one cut was straightforward against a piece of sacrificial ply. The other one would have had the tendency to fray the 44 mm plywood layer, and so I employed the painter's tape dodge to stop that happening. I broke all of the edges with 240 grit sandpaper, checked it one final time on the table, and applied a coat of my usual Zinza seal coat diluted by 1/3 with denatured alcohol. I designed a triangular turn button to rotate under the table to neutralise any tipping tendency when the sled was overhanging the front of the saw, and put them in the 3D printing queue. I planned for one each side near the back to achieve this, with the potential to add a second if needed. It could just as easily be cut from some 6 mm ply, but I indulged myself with my Festool green coloured filament to match the accent on the tools and my bench. Once printed, I drilled through the hole with a 5 mm drill and tweaked the countersink to fit a 5x40 mm screw, so there were no sharp edges. I fixed it 125 mm from the back end of the assembly, and it turns to cover the table frame and securely locates the device. Making the piece for the other side was now to be done. If you are making a sled for the table saw only, then it will be a case of simply making a mirror image of what you have seen. I had already made a spacer to bulk up my plywood cart side to be level with the edge of the table. The bearer was made in a similar way apart from the following considerations. There was more space for the fore and aft restrictors, and those were made from a scrap of the stained 20 mm oak skirting without any planing down. When screwing on the second 6 mm ply piece, the scraps of glued V-oak retained from before I used to allow the level clamping. I then ripped it down to make it uniform. These components had come from my proof of concept prototype, and I had started with 100 mm ply and 65 mm wide 44 centre component, and so it ripped down to be just under 100 mm, a few millimetres less than the side you have seen, but not of any significance. Trimmed to length and I was done. If I was making it again, I would start with 110 mm deep 6 mm ply and 75 deep 44 mm ply. That way I could trim down to the same size as the first one. Fitting it to the table, I could mark where the bottom of the piece reaches on the cart packer, allowing me to remove the packer, rip it, re-round it and screw it back on. I added 3 more marked screws as it felt a little unbalanced with the reduced width. The complete assembly is mounted to check the fit. Boo-boo alert. When I picked up the piece of unplaned oak to make the second side fore and aft limiter, my remaining brain cell had not processed that I had ripped the fourth V-groove piece at 40 mm from an 18 mm skirting board, and therefore this piece was 40 less the kerf, and said brain cell only noticed when I was playing with the dummy sled top. To fix it, I 3D printed and fixed a spacer so that I could measure from the front without having to remember to make the correction. I now had my two bearers and had to wait on the arrival of the M5x10 countersink socket head screws to fix the bearing blocks to my bearing plates, and they finally arrived. I would always go with a socket head, much easier to tighten compared to a cross point. I reamed out the 4 central holes to 5mm and fine-tuned the countersink so that the heads were flush with the surface of the plastic. The bearing and plates should be a snug fit in the channel, and the next decision was where to set the bearing blocks. I needed to be able to push the sled forward until its cutting fence would approximately meet the centre of the blade, and so the front bearings need to be set back from the front of the bearers, and measuring the blade to table edge of a distance of 215mm, I roughly calculated the setback to be about 275mm and put a single screw in each of the front plates. The position of the back plates is a bit of a compromise. The further in from the back, the further forward the table would slide and the wider the workpiece that could be cut. However, with increased cutting capacity came reduced spacing between the bearing blocks, and I settled on a 125mm set forward, which meant the blocks were about 1/3 of a metre apart. At that, even with just a single screw, the tracks seemed solid and the plastic tees were very effective at making the assemblies one with the table frame. There is a little maths here, but a lot of wet finger in the air and suck it and see, and you may choose your own spacing, of course, depending on the stock you want to cut. I wanted to see whether the bearing idea was a goer and bodged together 3 scraps to make an 1100 by 1200 piece of 12mm ply, and I screwed the offcut from the cart thickener from underneath to make a handle. I was really pleased the top slid freely back and forth with no wobble. It was time to take the plunge literally and start the saw. There is something unnerving about being so close to the naked blade without a kamikaze sausage to save me. I keep a scrap of Amtico LVT as a handy 2.5mm spacer, and it fits nice and snug in the slot. Repeatability was essential, and so I took off the table and replaced it and checked the movement in the spacer test. The blade rose through the table without issue. It was then a case of doing some measuring and marking to get an understanding of where the blade would be at the extremes of the sled's range, and so I marked where the blade will be emerging through the Festool tabletop at the front and back of the sled movement and the centre of the blade in the front and back position. Although the centre will not change, the protrusion of the blade will be less when a thicker 18mm ply top is used. I then created a prototype simple sled top based upon 12mm ply. This would let me get a feel for the sled and identify the shortcomings in my prototype design before I made the definitive sled in 18mm phenolic resin birch ply. I'll stop at this point and part 2 will follow soon, showing the construction of the sled. I think I've included everything needed for you to make this mechanism without you having to purchase plans, and so if you go on to make a sled, please consider making a PayPal donation to the channel. Writing the script and curating the photos and videos took me a long time. My son Malcolm has spent an even longer time presenting my work to you in a professional way. We are very happy to try and answer any questions. Many thanks to him, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.